Hi, Thrivers. I want to have a real conversation with you today. Not a quick tip, not something surface level, but something that I see over and over again in my work. People don't fully understand until they're already in the middle of it. And that's this: what marriage actually is and what divorce actually entails. And as you're listening to this, I'd actually love to know, have you ever thought about marriage this way before? Or is this a completely different perspective for you? You can just let me know in the comments. I read every single one. I'm Tammy Wallensack, a divorce mortgage specialist with over 30 years experience, and I'm here to help you make smart home decisions while you're navigating your divorce. I'm so glad you're here. Because most people don't think about these two things in the same sentence. When we think about marriage, we think about love, we think about choosing someone, we think about building a life together. We think about the home we're going to create, the routines, the holidays, the future. And that part's real, and that part matters. But there's another side to marriage that almost no one really talks about. And that side is that marriage is also a legal and financial structure. And I want you to really sit with that for a second. Marriage is not just emotional. It's also a contract, not just between you and your spouse, but between you, your spouse, and the state that you live in. And inside that structure are things like ownership, debt, income, responsibility, real estate, retirement, all of the things that make up your financial life. And if this is already shifting how you're thinking about things, just take a second and hit the like on this video. It really does help more people who are quietly trying to figure this out actually find this conversation. Because what I see over and over again is that most people don't understand that structure while they're in the marriage. Not because they did anything wrong, but because no one really explains it this way. You don't sit down before you get married and say, let's walk through what happens if one of us earns more. Let's talk about how the house would be handled if things change. Let's understand how debt's viewed between us. That's not how people really enter a marriage. People enter marriage with hope, with trust, with the belief that things will work. And for a long time, that's enough until something shifts. And when it shifts, that's when everything that wasn't fully understood starts to really matter. Now, I want to slow this part down a little bit because this is where I see people start to feel overwhelmed. Most relationships don't break in a loud, dramatic way. They change slowly, quietly. There's less communication, less connection, more distance, and eventually there's a moment when the question shows up: what happens if this doesn't work? And I'm really curious about this. You don't have to share anything personal, but have you ever thought about that? Even just quietly to yourself? If you're comfortable, just drop the comment yes below. You might be surprised how many people are sitting in that exact same place, because that question is bigger than it sounds. Emotionally, that's a question about your relationship. And financially, that's a question about everything you've built together. And this is where one of the biggest misunderstandings comes in. People think divorce is about separating their lives, but in reality, divorce is about unwinding a financial partnership. And those are two very different things. You can emotionally decide to go separate ways, but financially, you're still connected until everything is restructured. And if that structure was never fully understood, it can feel incredibly complicated. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and say something that I think is really important. Reasonable people get divorced. Kind people get divorced. Thoughtful people get divorced. People who tried get divorced. And I say that because I think there's this belief that divorce only happens when everything falls apart. But what I see in my work are people who simply reached a point where things were no longer working the way they'd hoped. And now they're trying to figure it out. How to move forward in a way that makes sense for them. And when people approach it from that place, it changes everything. It becomes less about conflict and more about clarity. Now, this is actually the point where most people end up reaching out to me because everything looks fine, but something doesn't really feel clear. Because here's what happens next. Two people sit down, they work through their agreement, they divide assets, they decide who's going to keep the house, they agree on support, and on paper, everything really looks good. It looks fair, it looks reasonable, it feels like, okay, we figured it out. But then they try to actually move forward. And that's when things start feeling different, because now the questions start coming up. Can I actually afford this house on my own? Will I qualify for the mortgage the way I think I will? Does the income I'm receiving count the way I assume it does? What happens if I can't refinance? What happens if timing doesn't line up? And this is the moment where people realize there's really a gap between what was agreed to and what's actually possible. And if you're in that place right now where you're trying to figure out if everything being discussed will actually work, I do have a guide below that walks you through the right questions to start asking. It's just there to help you think through this in a more structured, grounded way, because that gap is where people get stuck, because what looks good on paper does not always work in real life. And I want to say that again, because it's one of the most important things I can share with you. What looks good on paper does not always work in real life. Let's talk about the house for a minute, because this is where things become very real very quickly. And most people, the house is the largest asset in the marriage, but it's also emotional. It's where your life happened. It's where your kids feel safe. It represents stability. So when everything else feels uncertain, holding on to the house can feel like holding on to something solid. And that makes sense. But here's where you have to bring clarity into the conversation. Wanting to keep the house and being able to keep the house are not the same thing. And if this is something you're navigating, this might actually be a video for you that you want to save, or even send to someone who's helping you through this, so you can have more of a grounded conversation around it. Because I've seen people keep the house and really feel overwhelmed by it later. I've also seen people let go of the house and realize they had more options than they thought. And neither situation comes from bad decisions. They come from not having all the information early enough. Now, another piece of this that doesn't get talked about enough is timing. Timing in divorce, especially when it comes to real estate and financing, matters more than people think. When to refinance, when to sell, when to buy, when to wait. And if this part feels overwhelming, just know that's completely normal. Most people are trying to figure this out without a clear roadmap. And that's exactly why these conversations matter. Now, underneath all of this, there's something even more important happening. People are making some of the biggest financial decisions of their lives during one of the most emotional times of their lives. And that combination requires support, not pressure, not urgency, not fear, support, clarity, and understanding. If I could sit down with every person before decisions are made, before agreements are finalized, before everything is signed, I would tell them this: you don't have to rush. You do need to understand, because once everything's finalized, changing direction becomes much harder. And if this conversation is helping you see things a little more clearly, make sure you're subscribed here, because this is exactly what we talk about. Real guidance around the house, finances, and what actually works after divorce. Now, I want to leave you with something hopeful. There is a different way to approach this. There's a way to go through this process where you take the time to understand your options, where you look at what's actually possible, where you make decisions that work, not just on paper, but in real life. And that doesn't make it easy, but it does make it clearer. And clarity changes everything. So if you're in this place right now, where you're starting to ask these questions, or you're already in the middle of these decisions, just know this: you're not behind, you're not the only one going through this, and you don't have to have everything figured out today. But if you're ready to start understanding your specific situation, there are a couple ways I can help you below. You can start with a guide or take the next step in looking at your specific options. You don't have to do everything today, but you do deserve clarity around what's actually possible for you. And truly, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for spending the time with me and for being open to a conversation about this, and for allowing yourself to start looking at things in a different way. If this resonated with you or helped you feel even just a little bit more grounded, I'd love to hear from you in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.